Hi, I'm James from Future Voices podcast. Today I'm meeting with Detective Superintendent Gareth Williams from the British Transport Police. Gareth heads up the County Lines Task Force across England, Scotland and Wales. I found our conversation and the work we've done together really valuable. I hope you find it helpful. In February 2021, I was presented with a unique opportunity to use my safeguarding expertise in a different way by coming to work with the British Transport Police. It's there that I met Detective Superintendent Gareth Williams. Over the last 5 years, Gareth has led the County Lines Task Force, for which I have been the operational lead for safeguarding. Gareth's led a different approach where safeguarding is inherent within the work of the police, within the County Lines Task Force. And I have invited Gareth to join me in conversation for us to think through what's been successful about that work and what that means in terms of safeguarding across policing for the future. Would you like to introduce your role within British Transport Police?
Yes, I'm Gareth Williams. I'm a detective superintendent, and I am head of covert policing and county lines. That's a role that I've been engaged in since 2019. I run a proactive task force which covers, it has a national footprint, and they're proactive teams that engage with people that are involved in county lines activity every day on the railway network, which is really important to the county lines business model. So we're a very busy team.
And I'm interested to understand within your role how you've been able or how you've gone about driving a safeguarding agenda within an enforcement context.
Well, we have done things differently, as you've already alluded to, but some of that is through necessity. We see a much younger demographic involved in county lines on the railway network than other police services do across the UK. Even today, 40% of those individuals that we arrest are children or they're teenagers, so they're either very young adults or they're children. So we had to start and look at everything through a safeguarding prism. And my strategy reflected that right back in 2019 when I set it. I had to build a team, identify the right sort of personalities that would engage in this actively, show great enthusiasm, importantly show compassion with those that they were dealing with, and those that were keen to learn along the journey that we've had, and they've certainly done that. In terms of driving the agenda within my organisation and beyond, I think the key to our success has been relentlessly communicating successes, relentlessly communicating the impact and the importance of our work, canvassing others that certainly back in 2019 were often a little sceptical. Naturally, we work within the railway environment, and some of the train operating companies weren't particularly keen to consider that there may be children carrying Class A drugs and or weapons on the railway network. So, of course, we had to persuade them that this was the right thing to do on an ethical and moral basis. And then, of course, some police forces had a greater appetite for engaging with us and working with us in the county line space. But that has improved as well, and that's through communication. That is through persuasion, negotiating and influencing and getting people on board to work with us. And we're now in the happy state where we have people coming to us day in, day out to ask to work with us because we've built some real expertise within the team.
And that leads nicely onto the follow-up question for me, which was, what does safeguarding then now look like in the context?
Well, the first thing to say is safeguarding looks very different than it did 5 years ago. Essentially, safeguarding from a policing perspective is about protecting the vulnerable, particularly the vulnerable, and removing people from harm. In the county lines context, that can be as an offender, that could be as a victim. But today, we're much more sophisticated. I think some of that has evolved through our partnership work, which I've talked about briefly. but also from what we've learned, and what we've learned we need to be better at. Obviously, you've assisted the team and made great strides in terms of things like contextual safeguarding, ensuring that our officers are trauma informed. We've had inputs from really valuable inputs from lived experience. We've had training around issues such as adultification. But of course, those things will only help you improve if people are keen to improve. And I think we've all benefited from a mindset that we needed to get better. And now our operations are frequently supported by third sector organisations, by local authorities, by some other agencies out there that you wouldn't expect to see alongside us on these deployments, and you certainly would not have seen them 5 years ago when we started.
What have you observed the impact of that being for those individuals?
Well, the impact from my perspective, and one that I'm very pleased around, is that we make a lot of arrests. We make about 15 arrests a week. We're since we started on the 1st of December 2019, we've now made more than 3,200 arrests at the task force. And the task force equates to about 40 operational officers. So you can see that they're a busy team. What I'm pleased about, coming back to your question, is that those children that we arrest, we've criminalised about 18% of them. But 100% of them have had some form of safeguarding intervention. And that can mean moving a family house. It can mean just a straightforward referral, dependent on the level of vulnerability, dependent on the level of risk. But the fact that my officers look at the children they engage with as victims, and that's something that I've instilled from the start, that they need to understand that 17-year-olds, even when they're aggressive and they're involved in drug supply, aren't making conscious decisions to put themselves in danger. And the officers have responded in a way that they're not seeking to criminalise young people, and we're not. And of course, we're not a prosecuting authority. We don't make our own decisions about who we should charge or not. But we do have some flexibility in our interactions with the Crown Prosecution Service. And I'm very confident that the team do look at the young people that we deal with as victims. But interestingly, we extremely rarely find a young person that perceives themselves as a victim.
There's two questions that came up for me there. I might make a note of one of them. The first was, some might say that 18% is still too many of children if we are recognising that they're victims. And the second was thinking around the move that I've observed, really, and maybe this is more of an observation from initially officers not being clear around what the safeguarding looks like or could look like, to being much more direct around this is what needs to take place for this child. They're with us at this point in time, and we need to make sure we've got multidisciplinary eyes working together to drive whatever the next step should be. But going back to that first question, for those that would say that that 18% is too many, what's your view?
I think that this is an incredibly complex situation. It's not black and white, it never has been. There are a broad range of greys within it. And I'd say now that our ultimate goal is to charge people with human trafficking offences that are controlling, coercing young people. And we've been incredibly successful in that regard, securing 52 separate charges for Modern Slavery Act offences. But within that cohort of individuals charged, we have charged a small number of children with controlling much younger children. Mm-hmm. And that is very difficult. But this behaviour is so exploitative, so damaging, and it perpetuates. So there does come a time where the level of exploitation is untenable, irrespective of how you view the individual as a young person, whether they're a victim or an offender. We always start by considering the individual to be a victim, but sometimes it does tip over. And again, I'm not seeking to shift any responsibility, but it isn't my team that make charging decisions when we arrest. So we're not fully in control of that. But as I say, I'm very pleased with the fact that every young person we deal with gets a safeguarding intervention. Now, in terms of your second question, how has it shifted? The expertise that I imported, such as yourself, Amanda, who's done wonders for us, other colleagues that have come from a safeguarding background, nearly always local authority or third sector safeguarding background. That was a decision I took out of necessity because my background wasn't in that space, so I needed that expertise if we were going to be successful. I didn't really fully understand what it would bring us. And now 5 years down the line, I would say that what it has done, it's empowered my officers to make good decisions. In my long policing career, I've attended many strategy meetings, but as a police officer, I rarely said anything. I didn't think that it was necessarily my environment. I wasn't particularly comfortable on it. I was there because the police needed to be there. I wasn't trying to drive an agenda. My team certainly do now, and that's because we understand what buttons to press. We understand what language to use, and we're very confident in our own assessment of risk. And now we have that confidence. We're very content to persuade others of the importance of certain actions. And I again reflect on my own career. I don't think it would ever have been possible for me to turn around to social services and say that decision isn't good enough. We are doing that routinely now.
It's also making me reflect, having come into a different context, and thinking about that confidence to be able to, perhaps not so much confidence, but openness to hear what another agency's viewpoint is. And I've definitely taken, whether I've taken it or be given it in the position that I've held, come in with a view about what I think other agencies should be doing. And I think what's been very helpful is rolling back to what is it that we are all in agreement on here around someone's vulnerability or someone's needs, or risks that are perceived need to be responded to, and working from that point collectively as to how do we all work together. So having had that experience and working with your officers has been something that I've observed has shifted everyone's capacity to be able to work together, including my own, and therefore the social workers and the other agencies that I now interact with, around that we are different agencies, but that we each have a role to play within the environments that our young people are within. I think the other thing that stood out to me as well is that while we talk predominantly around county lines, that your team routinely come into contact with children that experience multiple different things, different forms of harm. I was surprised at how many children talk to the police and how many children will access police support. And that's sometimes can be in that critical time when they've been found by your officers. Other times it might be because they're lost. Other times it might be because they are the victims of an assault, or they've suffered another form of harm. And so while we're focused on county lines in the main, the impact of the work is broader than that when we think about how officers best create the conditions that can be as informed as possible to create safety for that child?
Well, I think, just picking up on what you've said, I think that is about courtesy and respect. And I've driven that very hard with the team. You're talking about a hard-hitting, front-foot, proactive police unit that is busy. It's dealing with people that are potentially violent, are sometimes quite violent, that are fearful because they know that if they get arrested, they're going to lose drugs or whatever commodity it is they're carrying. And despite that, and despite the way that the team are very keen to engage with members of the public that are involved in county lines, I'm always heartened by reviewing stop and search footage, for example, and the levels of respect that are shown to these individuals by my officers, I think is outstanding. And that's how they've built trust. That's how they're getting the engagement from the young people themselves, because we that's always going to be a difficult relationship between police and child, always. And I think it's probably as good as it could be within this context. And as I say, I'm really pleased to see the interactions that I do.
I was struck by something a young person said to me not that long ago, actually, which was, it's for you lot, as in police, children's social work, other agencies, it's for you lot to sort out how you're going to work together. And that really stood out to me, because I believe that sometimes time can be lost in us debating how and who should respond. And I think that what you're drawing out is an example of where that work has been successful in being able to unpack agendas, being able to work to align as best as possible what the overall aim is. And I suppose going back to the conversation earlier around that there may be some young people that are charged by police, that doesn't negate or doesn't mean that they don't also receive a better response from the multi-agency partnership around safeguarding.
Absolutely.
So one of the questions that I had was, what do you believe that police need from partners to be able to drive this type of approach?
I think it's a question of buy-in, really. A shared, agreed assessment of risk, a shared vision or joint priorities around where we want to be in terms of outcomes. And that's everybody's responsibility. I'm not suggesting that, I should just set priorities and every other agency that I might come into contact with should fall into line. I think I have a responsibility to identify what is in it for other agencies and sell that. Politically, I've done a lot of work, I've done a lot of canvassing, but that's been made slightly easier by the fact that we are directly government funded, so that access has been quite easy. But things like police and crime commissioners, I've spoken to many, countless MPs, but also into the sort of cabinet level. So getting that influence has been helpful, and that can, of course, has a knock-on influence for others that are involved with young people that get caught up in county lines. But I think it's about relationship building, it's about building trust, it's about building sort of shared goals, really. Clearly, at this moment in time, budgets are squeezed, but that doesn't mean that we can just not consider what we can do together. I think despite that difficult financial climate, we've all firstly got a responsibility to work together, but secondly, we've got an opportunity to be even more effective if we do identify that joint strategy. When we started the team, I didn't know how successful it would be. I didn't know anything anything like what I know today in terms of County Line's activity on the railway. Our learning has been exponential. But I did identify that the railway system essentially facilitates the offending. It's crucial to the business model, as I've already said, but drugs are moved from A to B. So there's an export location, there's an import location. We are the part in the middle. My team is the part in the middle. Interestingly, we didn't record any crime in terms of drug crime, really, on the transport network, unsurprisingly, because they were using it to move rather than offend. But the point I was going to make is that I knew from day one that we needed to tackle this in partnership. So I instructed the team that if anybody wants to work with us, we will work with them. Now, if you put that in a practical context, we see children from Liverpool in Cornwall regularly. We see children from London in places like Dundee and Inverness, surprisingly. And we see children from Birmingham in South Wales. But a mix of all those three locations, really, the children turn up all over the UK. So if we take the example of a Liverpool child in Cornwall, it's very easy for us to make an intervention, and whether that's a criminal justice intervention or just a safeguarding intervention is irrelevant. But unless we are working very closely with Merseyside, where that individual has emanated from, and Devon and Cornwall, and I'm talking about police agencies at the moment, then we won't have any success. And you need to expand that into local authorities, children's care, potentially education services. Everybody needs to be around that table when you hold that strategy meeting. And that is a position that we've made huge progress on.
As you're talking, I'm working out the logistics of what you're saying and which local authorities that would involve and how that would need to be navigated concerning who holds ownership of that child versus where they are in the country. And so one of those key things being the I suppose that what I observe is the swiftness of response. So you have somebody with you today, and the move that we've seen is that we need that response today. And we need to be clear around what that strategy is to not only not only investigate, but also safeguard.
Well, I think that's one of our big changes, James, and you've been responsible for a lot of that, is that at the point of intervention with a child, wherever it may be in the UK, we commence our safeguarding plan at the same time. So it runs simultaneously with the criminal investigation. I think traditionally we would have seen an investigation through and at the end thought, well, what are we going to do about the child? And that's been flipped fully on its head. So we know that those two things can run very comfortably in parallel.
I think that's something that certainly for me, reflecting on that work, is that child is stood with you on a platform most of the time. And each minute that goes by while that officer is trying to navigate who to contact, how to get through to the right person, is another minute that child is stood on the platform. And that certainly is a move from the police have dealt with a child, they've then made their referral, that then lands on the desk of the social work team perhaps the next day or after. And at that point, we've lost a substantial chunk of time. And what you're describing is pushing forward that safeguarding being right from the get-go. One, to inform what's the knowledge, risk and vulnerability, the needs of that child at that point, if you can get hold of the information. The second part is what's the onward plan? What's the next steps for the multi-agency group? And I suppose bringing back to when you were talking about the multi-agency deployment is when those staff are on site, actually that in some ways you relinquish your police involvement because you're able to engage that child or that vulnerable adult with the services that can best meet their needs, be that social care, be that adult substance support. And there's some good examples that I've observed, where actually somebody who may be better supported through those services, I've observed officers take the view, well, actually, then that's not for us, because that's the best outcome.